I'm Paul Brest, president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And before I turn to my major task, which is introducing Tim Wirth, I want to say a word a bit off subject. As you can't help but notice if you read the newspapers these days, foundations are under attack, and particularly these days for administrative costs. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to say that this is a conference that was born in administrative costs. It was born in the collaboration between two foundations, TOSA and the Hewlett Foundation, but really in collaboration between two people, because administrative costs ultimately are people. Kate Greswold, president of TOSA, and Juliette Gimont, who during the year she helped put this project together, was a fellow at the Hewlett Foundation. Kate is John and Tasha Morgridge's daughter. Juliette is the daughter of Eleanor Gimont and the granddaughter of Bill and Flora Hewlett. Long before there was a grant, and of course grants aren't administrative costs, but long before there was a grant, Kate and Juliette spent hours and hours and weeks and months really designing this conference. It took much of Juliette's fellowship year, I can tell you, because she reported to me, and it took other resources as well at the Hewlett Foundation, which are administrative costs. Eventually, they found a very worthy grantee in the World Affairs Council, but that in itself required extensive due diligence, and that is an administrative cost as well. So the short of it is that when you hear the word administrative costs, recall that the Foundation's major costs are the people who design programs, who do due diligence to find good grantees, and people like Kate and Juliette. And since we have these two particular administrative costs with us today, I hope they will stand and we will acknowledge them. Well, that said, I'd like to invite you to the 7th plenary session on philanthropy and advocacy. The topic this afternoon is the role of funders as advocates. For many of us, this has been and continues to be a controversial area. Some people feel that philanthropy should stay very much in the background. Others feel that it has a special role to play in the public arena. Perhaps after our major speaker speaks, I'll say a few words about the Hewlett Foundation's own thinking about this, which is very much in evolution. But right now I turn to a speaker who is no stranger to these issues, Tim Wirth, former senator from Colorado, currently president of the United Nations Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Tim.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to the Hewlett Foundation for your support of this terrific forum. I was flattered to be asked to speak again at the Global Philanthropy Forum, just as I'm flattered by the attentions, as Dick Schlossberg and others of us are, from all of you. We have money, you give us attention, we're flattered, we think it's a great thing. But anyway, thank you all very much for being here. And like last year, we are benefiting from a very rich discussion, from talented colleagues and excellent leadership from Jane Wales and the Hewlett Foundation and the Morgridge family. Jane, I think that it might be a good idea to set up a Cisco Academy within the Global Philanthropy Forum for those of us who are technologically challenged by all of these issues, another chore for the Global Philanthropy Forum. Ted Turner, our founder at the UN Foundation, was here a few weeks ago and spoke to the forum, or members of the forum. I'm sure that Ted reminded, or might have reminded you of how we got started. As you know, Ted Turner has been a long-time supporter of the UN Foundation, of the United Nations, and was very unhappy about the fact that the United States Congress had run up a deficit of more than $1 billion to the UN. Ted, in his inimitable fashions, his initial instinct was to pay off the debt to the United Nations, and then sue the United States Congress for $1 billion. That was not possible, so here we are with the UN Foundation and Ted's $1 billion. I am especially pleased to be able to contribute to a program that features Graça Machel and Mohamed Yunus as well, two members of the small but distinguished governing board of the United Nations Foundation. They've written our charter and mission statement, which includes a significant focus on public affairs, which is my topic today. Last year I made brief remarks on the need for greater philanthropic advocacy. Jane asked me to expand on that theme this year, so bear with me while I attempt to develop the following thesis. Your philanthropy will be much more successful in reaching its goals and going to scale if you enter the public arena and include a heavy dose of advocacy. You can organize at the grassroots, educate state legislators, lobby the Congress, all within the law as written by Congress and explicated in guidelines promulgated by the IRS. And this is as true in the international as in the domestic arena. You have a point of view, and you need policy allies to help argue before the public, engage the media, walk the legislative corridors, and persuade government officials. If you don't join the public debate, you have an absolute chance of not winning it. Like me, I bet that most of you don't think that you're winning. You probably have a general uneasy feeling that you're on the losing side in the battle for social, economic, and environmental progress, as you see it. And like many of us, you have a sense that there are broader, better organized forces out there who are winning the battle for public acceptance and public support. And you're right. These early years of the 21st century look a lot different from the heyday of philanthropy as it has traditionally been known, when it had a point of view, new ideas, bold initiatives, and even influence within governments at all levels. The record speaks for itself. The Civil Rights Program, the Poverty Program, family planning and reproductive health, environmental protection, institutions of global cooperation. These were ideas that became realities, in significant part because progressive philanthropy sponsored careful research, developed applied policy to reflect the research findings, trained a cadre to carry out the policy within generously supported institutions, explained their policies to the public, and had a receptive ear in government. During this golden age of progressive philanthropy, affirmative action entered the national lexicon. Compensatory education provided opportunity for millions of children. Public television and its flagship Sesame Street took to the air. Legal services provided representation to the disenfranchised. Neighborhood health centers popped up all across the country, and we learned about clean air, clean water, wilderness, and the global commons. And Americans from all walks of life were encouraged by a number of well-funded organizations to support cooperation and alliances in a highly successful web of global treaties and international agreements. Many of our great philanthropic institutions were behind these efforts. Carnegie with education, Rockefeller in family planning, Ford in the poverty programs, Markle with public television, Mott and the Community Foundation movement, to name a few. Each of these great foundations had policies focused on turning ideas into policy. Their leadership was familiar with the corridors of power, and their boards were eager to build new institutions and train a new generation of leadership. Flip forward to 2003. Today, some of the most influential voices and ideas are also supported by philanthropies, but the names and perspectives are new and often unexpected. The Bradley Foundation, John M. Olin, Smith Richardson, Richard Mellon Scaife. Watching and learning from years of the successes of others, but with a very different point of view, they are now harvesting a carefully conceived and nurtured agenda that began 30 years ago, in reflection of a sharply different perspective on the world, its problems, and probable solutions. This change first came to my attention in the mid-1970s. The Coors family lived and brewed beer in the congressional district which I represented. In addition to spending tens of thousands of dollars trying to remove me from public office, they were not shy about investing in new social and political institutions which reflected their view of the world. And when they announced that they were going to invest nearly $1 million to start something called the Heritage Foundation, I remember being delighted. This was money I wouldn't have to worry about. How wrong I was. Coors was followed by other like-minded conservative philanthropists who have funded an array of new and effective institutions, including the Cato Institute, whose signature policy issue is the privatization of Social Security, Paul Weyrich's Free Congress Foundation, dedicated to modern culture wars, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, an early Star Wars supporter, the Family Research Center, helping to catalyze the Right to Life movement and spawning Gary Bauer, the American Enterprise Institute, which is today probably Washington's most far-reaching forum for public policy ideas, and the American Legislative Exchange Council, advocating conservative agendas for state legislatures. These are no longer fledgling fringe players. They have a significant impact on the legislative, policy, and political agenda in America today. The list of their initiatives that are now in the mainstream is long and impressive. Perhaps most famous was Newt Gingrich's Contract with America, which, while it did not pass in its totality, created a coherent policy statement with unifying themes not dissimilar from the unifying efforts that earlier 3 decades before were united by the poverty program. The contract has evolved into a series of major initiatives, the antecedents of which date back to concerted, well-focused philanthropy, which reflect a point of view about the role of government and the direction of our society. Welfare reform, school vouchers and medical savings accounts, the mainstreaming of faith-based institutions, constitutional limitations on expenditures, challenges to affirmative action. The agenda stretches around the world through the global gag rule, environmental deregulation, organizing opposition to small arms control and the ban on landmines, abandonment of the International Criminal Court, and such international human rights initiatives as those covering the protection of children and ending discrimination against women. Efforts even continue to persuade Americans that the UN is irrelevant. Disagree as strongly as I do with most of these ideas and initiatives, I admire the skillful way in which these efforts have been mobilized, and I respect in every way the right of all of the parties to participate in America's democratic experiment. The intellectual leadership for government policy and expenditures has shifted dramatically and impressively, has become deeply rooted, and is extremely successful. It is tempting to derisively and defensively brush off these efforts as a vast right-wing conspiracy, as if something was done in a closed, clandestine, and perhaps illegal fashion. It was anything but. This change was built through careful and focused use of the leverage of democratic government, the generation of ideas, the transformation of those ideas into policy, the marketing of the policy changes, the cultivation of public leadership, the persuasion, lobbying of policymakers, and the building of a constituent base, all with a very sophisticated understanding of the opportunities made available through the tax code and detailed in long-standing interpretations by the Internal Revenue Service. This last point deserves special attention. Every mission statement in this room, I bet, includes reference to the need for social progress or social change, domestically or internationally. And we all hope that our ideas go to scale, that society will adopt some of our values and points of view. That's been the history of philanthropy in America. We want to make a better world, and like it or not, our governmental institutions and the laws that govern us are essential to that task. And again, our history is instructive. In the ebb and flow of public debate, a free society needs the tension and testing of conflicting ideas and is stronger as a result. If you believe in something, leaving the field to others is not much of an option, any more than not voting or not being informed about our community, state, nation, or the world. Within a democratic society, we all have responsibility. And I would argue that those of us who've been entrusted with shepherding scarce philanthropic resources have a special responsibility. Now, we may believe that our projects and ideas are so intrinsically valuable that they'll be copied and taken to scale. But I think this is a pretty naive view of how the world works. Rather, if we believe in what we're funding and are hopeful about replicability, we have to work the system. This means that we have to educate, persuade, and sometimes lobby our government. Good laws and good governance are essential to good public policy, and I, for one, want to help define what good means. If, at the mention of advocacy, or the lobby word, the L word, you're fidgeting uncomfortably in your chairs, let me assure you that it is absolutely legal for foundations to support public charities that lobby. The Internal Revenue Service has provided clear guidelines and regulations for the lobbying activities of public charities and for foundations making grants to public charities that lobby. Let me expand and get technical for a minute, because remarkably few know of these provisions of the law, and even fewer take advantage of them. In 1976, Congress passed legislation giving public charities the right to lobby up to defined percentages of their annual expenditures. Section 501H and its companion, Section 4911, set specific dollar limits on the amount that electing public charities may spend to influence legislation without incurring penalty taxes and without losing their exempt status. To clarify the law, in 1990, the IRS promulgated regulations governing Section 501H, describing clearly the conditions under which private foundations can support public charities that lobby. The IRS even made it extremely simple for organizations to indicate that they want to take advantage of the clear definitions and generous limits on lobbying, an election which eligible organizations can make without changing their 501c3 status. This is a single-page form, a copy of which has been distributed to everyone today, and you all have a copy of it. Fill in your name, address, Social Security number, and send it in. So in the marketplace of ideas, which we're advancing and which we presumably support, what's the problem? The government has promoted and encouraged balance in the presentation of conflicting views and made it easy for us to argue our point of view. But precious few organizations have taken advantage of this provision of the law. Worse, many foundations, including some of the biggest and best known, actually prohibit their grantees from using their grants to lobby, even though IRS rules make it clear that no such prohibition is legally required if the grantee is a public charity. The panels yesterday morning and today provided a number of crystal clear examples of issues that need to be worked. Most of us want debt relief for the poorest countries, but this won't happen until Congress makes a change in how debt is counted in the federal budget. We heard agonized discussions about how destructive American agricultural subsidies are to poor nations. But this won't change until Congress changes the law. Fears were voiced about the power of media concentration, but the FCC's recent decision will stand unless Congress turns it back. Concession payments to countries for oil, gold, and other commodities are famously corrupting and spawn violence and civil war, but they won't change until international standards for reporting and transparency are established by governments who have to be persuaded not to look the other way. And Graça Machel and her panel this morning described well the thicket of policy issues surrounding women's reproductive health and the empowerment of women and Adele Simmons accurately told about the successful Cairo process. Now, Susan Orr described yesterday Packard's support for the Aldo Leopold Fellows Program to encourage young scientists to enter the public fray, to speak, to write, to testify, to teach and persuade public officials. This is a big idea with leverage. Where is its equivalent for debt relief, for agricultural subsidies, for media concentration, for standards of concessions, for renewing the fight for reproductive health? These are some of the big international issues that cry out for resolution and which need carefully focused help from the philanthropic community. And of course, there are many others as well. The point is a simple one. We should get together and get our hands dirty once again. Too much is at stake for us to cede the field. This is the stuff of the democratic process. And for as privileged as we in this room are, we have a special duty to enter the debate, strengthen the process, and to help reap the harvest of opportunities that are out there and presented to us. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
We're going to throw this open to questions and comments from you in a moment, but I'd just like to say a word about Tim's very, very important points and bring it home to a dilemma that we at the Hewlett Foundation face, and maybe some other foundations and nonprofits face as well. We regard ourselves primarily as social problem solvers. And many of the problems that we address, and Tim has mentioned some of the ones that concern us, on population, for example, are an important aspect of the solution is changing public policy. And public policy is changed through advocacy. We have a point of view. We have a point of view on issues of education, the environment, population, and others as well. That's the one hand. On the other hand, the foundation has a well-enjoyed, well-deserved reputation as being a source of trusted, impartial information. When something goes out with the Hewlett Foundation's name on it, people have a right to believe that it is accurate. Advocacy doesn't necessarily mean being untrustworthy or partial, but there's a strong tendency in advocacy to exaggerate the claims that support your position and to denigrate or ignore those that support others' positions. Trust me, I was trained as a lawyer. I know about this. The conservative foundations have been enormously successful, as Tim notes. The question for us is, can we do advocacy and not be like the conservative foundations? Because the conservative foundations do exaggerate a point of view and denigrate and belittle other points of view. So can a foundation that wants to maintain a reputation for integrity and impartiality do advocacy nonetheless? The answer is yes. It may mean some constraints that other organizations don't have. For us, this is kind of a work in progress, how we do it, how we continue to do it, and a challenge for my board and me and my staff. So I just raise that not as a counterpoint to Tim's very persuasive argument, but as a concern that we and perhaps some of you in your organizations have as well. With that, there are microphones available, are they, roving around the audience, and it's your turn, especially to get some of Tim's knowledge.
Wayne Jaquith. I went to one of the sessions this morning on working with Islam, and a good chunk of it was given over to the voluntary guidelines that the IRS is accepting comments on now through July 18th that would seriously chill the giving of money to organizations that may give or be associated with or somehow have some consultant that may be associated with terrorism in some way. And can you say a little bit about those regulations and how they are going to impact the work of this community and what might be done about them?
Well, I think there are two issues here. There's a broad issue and there's a specific issue. The broad issue is the Patriot Act and where it came from and many of the assumptions that underlie it. You know, it appeared out of a Congress with, as the Congress today spends very, very little time in kind of public debate. 85% of the legislation that went through the United States House of Representatives in the last Congress had not a single day of public hearing. Most of it is presented from a committee, goes to the floor, the Rules Committee sets the rules in which it goes to the floor, there's an up or down vote, and the democratic process is totally stifled. The Patriot Act and most that came out of the Patriot Act is no exception. So the broad issue, you know, is an issue of openness in government and continuing to look at what's going on in our democratic society, what's happened to the public hearing process. Why is the budget, when it's presented every year, no longer have the indices in the back that tell governors or mayors or interest groups how much is in there for certain kinds of education or how much is going to California or how much is going to East Palo Alto? You can't find that anymore in the budget. You know, this process, openness in government, has reversed a trend very significantly, and I think what we see in the Patriot Act is a symptom of the broader issue. And, you know, I think that we all have a responsibility not only to know about that, but to be focused on and supporting, I believe, institutions like Common Cause and People for the American Way and so on, who are really working this day in and day out to get this into the public's attention and to get the changes made that have to be made. That's the broad issue. The more narrow issue is the current so-called hearings or public input. You know, I would be very surprised if that public input, you know, is any better than the public hearings that we have in front of the Congress, but you take what you got and you got to deal with it. And each one of us, I think, has a responsibility, if this is of concern to you, and it should be, if you're funding various groups, you know, to comment on why you think this is chilling and why this is different. I think that Paul Brest and the science that we heard about yesterday from the Hewlett Foundation and the Packard Foundation and others ought to be very troubled by this. You know, what's happening in terms of scientific exchanges, what's happening in terms of the opportunity, you know, to create the free flow of ideas that was espoused very aggressively yesterday afternoon, and for which the objectivity and engagement of that is terribly important. Well, I think this has an opportunity, as I think your question suggests, Wayne, to really be stifled. And who's going to do something about this? Well, there are a number of NGOs out there who are responding, and probably universities, but I think we all have an opportunity as funders to look for places where we can help to illustrate what's going on. I mean, we in the UN Foundation are not impacted on it. We're a public charity, but we deal with the UN, so everything that we do goes through the UN. You know, maybe it's our responsibility to figure out if this particular approach continues. Maybe we can figure out how we can become a home for a lot of different exchange programs and skirt around it. But that certainly is not, you know, what the UN ought to be doing, and it certainly is not, it seems to me, reflective of what, you know, a democratic society ought to do and what we encourage around the world in terms of transparency, free flow of ideas, and so on.
There are some people, Tim, who might think the UN is a terrorist organization. Ought to be on this list. No, seriously, this is, I mean, there's no group that I can think of to whom this matters more than the people in this room. Because the concern, and there still is a comment period, and I think Tim is right, get your concerns in. The Council of Foundations is working on this and will have a response for the philanthropic sector, but it would be very good for you to get your opinions into the Council on Foundations. The concern is not funding a terrorist organization. An organization has been listed as terrorist. That we can figure out. I mean, there'll be a list. There may be obvious concerns about people being on the list who shouldn't be, but a funder can at least figure that out. The worry is that there are possibilities of the regulations going beyond that and requiring a degree of due diligence to make sure that that in no way, none of the funds could even get from an organization to somebody else listed as a terrorist organization, that would really make international grant making very, very difficult. So do express your concerns, especially with the Council on Foundations, which within a couple
Council
of
on
weeks,
Foundations is a good route, right? But you've got 2 United States senators here, and everybody's got a member of Congress, and you know a whole lot of other people. I mean, they've got to hear as well. And, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That is a reality of American politics, and you got to squeak if you're concerned. And on this one, I think we got to do more than squeak.
John Harvey with Grantmakers Without Borders. I'd just like to note Grantmakers Without Borders is a funders coalition. We represent largely small to mid-sized funders. The Council has indeed responded. Our particular interest is in the interests of small and mid-sized funders. So we are, as a group, submitting something to Treasury, separately working on a strategy around the IRS. And that request for feedback. Separately also, the American Bar Association is interested in gathering information, and under their cover, folks who may be a little shy to put their name on any document submitted to the IRS may submit something to the ABA, which we believe will have tremendous credibility at the IRS. So our website is guab.net if you would like to connect with us and work with us on these issues.
That's good to hear. Thank you. Repeat the website.
www.gwob.net, GWAB.
Ann Carroll, Peruvian American Interchange Society, and I'd like to present a question that I hope won't be unwelcome in regards to the UN Foundation and making the UN more relevant to what we're doing here. And it has to do with the black hole or the blind spot of foundations, with the exception of Soros and Open Society here in the States, regarding drug addiction. Considering that heroin is the cause of 15 to 20% of U.S. and Western European AIDS and 70% of Asian and Russian AIDS, the dropping of the ball of foundation support for heroin addiction solutions, which are low-tech, cheap, and here already, is a sad oversight. Recently, I had asked of the UN Foundation that they carry the ball to the UN on this, and they punted to UNDCP, the UN Drug Control Program, throwing it in their lap, and the UNDCP is notoriously badly managed. It's chaotic. The UN Foundation is really the only entity that can make the UN relevant on a quick and we have a short window of opportunity if we deal with heroin now to substantially stanch AIDS breakout in India, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, and I'm begging you, Senator Wirth, to pick up the ball on this. UNDCP can't and won't do it. You've got the money and the expertise.
Well, it's like, you make a very good case, and it's like a whole, the UN's business is the world's business, and, we've had to focus our efforts on a few. We've chosen women's reproductive health, we've chosen children's health, and polio and measles in particular. We've chosen some aspects of the international environmental crisis and some issues in peace, security, and human rights. And to spend our limited capital, across a whole lot of different places, there's an impulse to do that. But our own response to that was we were not going to do that. We're going to try to stay, I say to people, focus, focus, focus. We are deeply concerned about strengthening aspects of the UN, and it may well be that there are ways in which we can do that with UNDCP. We will certainly not run projects in the area of drug area, but, we may be we ought to be looking at how we can help UNDCP. Like a lot of other UN agencies, they, are agencies that are incredibly underfunded. The expectations for what they do are very, very high. Their operating modalities are often, ones that are not as modern as they might be. That's a nice political statement. And, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think UNDCP is probably one of those. Thank you.
just to reach some closure on the issue of the guidelines and the Treasury regulations. There was a paper presented, I wrote it this morning in the session on partnering with Islamic communities, that describes in detail the provisions of the Treasury guidelines. This does not apply only to groups supporting certain groups. It applies across the board to all international grant-making by American private foundations, public charities, and others. The paper also contains specific information about how to respond to Treasury, to whom it should be addressed, and the deadlines involved. Copies of the paper are available outside on the registration desk. This is a cross-cutting issue. It was put into the session on Islamic communities simply for convenience, but it would be a great mistake to think it only affects people who fund Islamic charities. It affects all of us.
Thank you. I think we have time perhaps for one more question. Does she have a microphone?
Adele? Oh.
Well, good. We actually can end on time. I think that you're going to be asked to keep your seats so that Sylvia Matthews can begin to lead her panel on philanthropy's policy role. And right now, let me just, on behalf of all of us, thank Tim Wirth for being here. Thank you very much.